chemical gases, even window frames. So where are we now? We have taken a few steps in EP legislation. We have enhanced producer responsibility. We have enforced a more stringent landfill ban and waste norms. We have started to prevent the exporting of electronic scrap under the WEEE directive, and we have included the leasing society in a number of sections, for instance in the flagship initiative on a resource-efficient Europe. What we need is disruptive thinking, and maybe today in this library we can start to think disruptively and start to think about a different economy which is different than today, but which is still livable. Thank you.
And now we introduce Lowitt, who has written a book. I mean, he is an expert on what I just very superficially touched upon.
I don't know if I can add anything more insightful to your remarks. I'll have done very well. But to give it a shot, let me first say thank you to both you, Judith, and as well, Mr. Alvaro, for just allowing me to be here tonight. Sometimes I think being in whether in Strasbourg or here in Brussels, being part of the EU Parliament, you almost can run the risk of taking it for granted. But as an American, I look to the efforts to pull together so many states and coming in from so many different directions with so many interests, and I look at it with great awe. And so it truly is an honor for me to be here tonight. I flew in just this morning, and to make the flight a lot easier, I had the privilege of somebody's company who I'd like to acknowledge as well at the outset, who is one of Boston's most generous philanthropists, Mr. William Chabelle. It's my father-in-law over there waving, and probably is going to have his face turn red in just a moment or two. So Bill, thank you for being here as well. Now, I already said this, but let me say this just one more time. To me, the European Parliament is absolutely vital to our worldwide ability to achieve a state of sustainable development. The companies in the EU zone, I'm thinking of companies from H&M to Unilever, Greek Green, we'll talk about Greek Shipping Group in just a little bit as well. These are companies that are starting to revolutionize many of the aspects of the leasing society that Judith has described, as well as the collaboration economy that I'll describe in just a little bit. It's not an overstatement to say that the actions of the EU Parliament, combined with many of these Europe-based companies, are the reason why I chose to dedicate my life to, in fact, achieving a state of sustainable development for not only everyone in the room, but for our 7 billion neighbors today and our 9.5 billion neighbors to come over the next 3 decades. With that in mind, I'm here tonight to help us secure our common future. Because the fact is that we have 3 conflicts that if we cannot overcome, we will not have a common future as we know it right now. Said more forcefully, we have to overcome the conflicts of math, trust or distrust, and economic behavior. And these are 3 conflicts that we have got to win now. Each conflict in isolation can in fact be turned into an opportunity that we can use to bring about the leasing society as Judith so eloquently described, with the collaboration economy that I'll describe in a little bit. But the frustrating truth is that these 3 conflicts of math, trust, and economic behavior don't operate in isolation. In fact, they're intertwined and are becoming ever more intertwined every day. Talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Because tonight I'll first describe these 3 conflicts, then I'll talk more about what is it that we need to do to overcome the conflicts of math, trust, and economic behavior. And finally, I'll dedicate a significant portion of time to what I believe the European Parliament can do to help facilitate change that will indeed drive disruptive thinking that secures our common future. So let me start here. the first conflict we face is a conflict with math. Let me pose this very deceptively difficult math problem to everyone here tonight. We have 7 billion people living on our planet right now. The UN forecasts that we'll have between 9.5 and 10 billion people by 2050. That's growth of 33% over today's levels. So how do we find a way to house, feed, shelter, provide energy for, water for, and reasonable standard of living for not only 7 billion people today, but 10 billion people in 30 years, when there's one natural resource that gets so little attention but that will never expand? Anybody want to take a quick guess what resource I'm talking about? I'm talking about land. Right? We spend so much time talking about hydrocarbon fuel sources, which desperately needs our attention and our action. We spend a great deal of time talking about water. I've heard it often said that water is our current generation's oil. Right? Much the way that we feared not too long ago that we were facing a battle, an approach toward peak oil, we've also feared that we are facing a battle or an approach toward peak water. But it's land that will never expand. And let me actually bring that just to light a little bit more as a way to help drive this math problem home. When I was in university, I lived in Kyoto. I studied in Japan for 2 years, lived with a host family that lived on a brand new piece of land in Kyoto that was made out of a blasted off top of a mountain. And that blasted off top of a mountain ended up having massive environmental impacts, because as it turned out, that mountain was critical for watershed, snow that would turn into water that in turn would feed the downstream rice paddies that this community in Kyoto where I lived actually lived off. 10 years ago, I lived in Kyoto 20 years ago. 10 years ago, I found out that these rice paddies no longer exist because we sacrificed rice paddies, water, and food for the need for land. Land is an intractable math problem, especially in light of everything I've talked about in terms of our growing population. But there's something else about our growing population in math that's critical to note, and it's this. We all have the right to eat. We need to eat. Go 21 days without eating, we're no longer here. We go 3 days without drinking water or drinking any beverages of any kind, we're no longer here. So we have a global food system that's built to feed 7 billion people today, but sadly 2 billion people are failed by that same global food system right now. We have 1 billion who are malnourished, and an additional 1 billion who are suffering from some sort of lifestyle affliction, such as diabetes, obesity, and coronary artery disease. So if we try to think about how do we scale a global food system that already is stretched and showing exposed cracks and flaws, to go from 7 billion people today to 10 billion people tomorrow, we desperately need disruptive thinking to solve that math problem. There's a second portion of this math problem that I want to highlight to make sure that we're clear about this particular conflict, and that's the math problem of income disparity. And there are two areas of income disparity that I want to briefly touch on tonight. As the father of a daughter, and even if I wasn't, equality is absolutely critical to me from a gender perspective. And yet, it's just, there's such injustice from the fact that 2/3 of our working hours are performed by women, and yet women only receive 10% of the world's pay. Just, where is the justice and injustice of that nature? Along a similar vein, but removing the gender description for a second, the divide in income disparity between the have and have-nots has continued to grow and continues to accelerate. Indeed, we're at a point now where many in the have-nots category now have to make decisions not between car X and car Y, but between food and medicine, between shelter and education, and between living for today and investing in their children's tomorrow. That simply cannot continue. There's one more conflict of math that I want to quickly highlight before moving on to trust. We've talked at length, I'm sure, within the European Parliament over the years about climate change. I live in the northeast of the United States, where just a year ago we suffered from Superstorm Sandy, followed by a major nor'easter called Nemo, where we had a tremendous amount of disruption, not only of business, but just of personal lives. My kids couldn't make it to school, as an example. And it was a nice benefit. I got to play with my kids for a few extra days. But still, when we look at the ominous hand of climate change, we note two things rather clearly. One, scientists have proven the anthropogenic hand of man in climate change is real, is evident, and is at this point irreversible. The second thing we know is as long as we continue along the path of what we are seeing as business as usual, that is not reducing our carbon emissions, whether it's from citizens, all of ours, including my lifestyles, business, factories, or other areas as well, by 2047, 5 billion people at least, of those 10 billion people I mentioned earlier, will be living in a vastly different climate than they do today without having to move. Said very simply, we're hastening our planet's evolution. But in the process, we're running the risk that we're pushing our way of life toward imminent extinction. We have to find a way to balance economic development with efforts to address this math problem. And as we think about math as one dimension of the three dimensions of conflict I've mentioned earlier, we would be remiss if we didn't also reflect on trust, or in my case, distrust, as a second conflict. Because said simply, and both Judith and Alexander, both of you have said this so eloquently, we need public-private and civil sector collaboration to tackle the massive challenges that are in front of us. But the civil sector comes from a certain point of view, the private sector holds a certain point of view, and the public sector holds a certain point of view, and they're not always aligned. And so sometimes we all have to compromise, and compromise requires trust. Now, as an American right now, and as an American citizen right now, I'm both comfortable and uncomfortable standing in front of you knowing that my government is standing on the precipice of an imminent debt default. Unprecedented. And frankly, inconceivable. But as a citizen, if I think about my federal government's governing agencies, I can understand why in 2012, when a company called Edelman did its annual Edelman Trust Barometer Index, which measures the level of trust that different groups, different sectors, citizens, public sector, and private sector have in one another, it's no surprise that in 2012, American citizens like myself said only 38% of us trust our government to act in our best interests in the short, middle, and long term. The European Parliament, we feel similar pressures. And we've got so many different interests tugging at the fabric of this well put together quilt. We just have to look at the Eurozone financial crisis as but one example. But as I think about that, and I think about the issue of how do we pull together trust, I'd be